Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1909, and the Appalachian region of southeastern Ohio was a place of stark contrasts. Dense forests sprawled across rugged terrain, hiding small communities that lived by their own rules, isolated from the progress of the industrial cities that were rapidly changing America. In these remote hollows, old ways persisted, and some stories were only whispered about when darkness fell. Among the most unsettling accounts from this era is the case that became known as the Man with No Eyes. What follows is a documented investigation into events that occurred in and around the small logging settlement of Sharpsville, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, approximately 18 miles east of Athens, Ohio. The discovery was made on November 12, 1909, when local hunter Everett Caldwell ventured deeper than usual into the forest while tracking a wounded deer. According to his sworn statement to the Athens County Sheriff, Caldwell found himself in an unfamiliar ravine as dusk approached. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and a light snow had begun to fall. The wind whistled through the bare branches of oak and hickory trees, creating an eerie melody that seemed to follow Caldwell as he pushed forward. Caldwell described how he came upon a small, dilapidated cabin partially hidden by overgrowth. The structure appeared abandoned, yet smoke rose from its chimney. The cabin sat in a narrow clearing, surrounded by dense woods on three sides and backed against a steep incline that led up to a rocky ridge. Years later, Caldwell would recall how unnatural the silence had seemed as he approached. No birds called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. He described it as a pocket of stillness in the forest, as if nature itself was holding its breath. According to the official report filed 3 days later, Caldwell knocked on the door but received no response. The hunter claimed he felt watched despite seeing no one. The windows of the cabin, he noted, were unusual, not merely dirty or broken as one might expect in an abandoned structure, but meticulously covered with what appeared to be layers of newspaper and dark cloth, secured with rusted nails driven haphazardly into the wooden frames. No light escaped from within, despite the smoke suggesting occupancy. As darkness was falling quickly, and the cabin represented his best chance for shelter from the approaching storm, Caldwell pushed open the door, which was not locked but rather secured with a simple wooden latch. The door swung inward with a prolonged creak that Caldwell would later describe as sounding like a human moan, so much so that I nearly turned and ran right then. What Caldwell found inside would lead to one of the most perplexing investigations in Ohio's rural history, one that would remain officially unresolved in the state archives for decades. The interior of the cabin was sparsely furnished but meticulously organized. A small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a cast-iron stove occupied most of the space. A kerosene lamp hung from a ceiling beam, unlit despite the gathering darkness. Everything appeared clean, unusually so for such a remote dwelling, with no dust visible on any surface. A pot of what appeared to be stew simmered on the stove, suggesting the occupant had stepped out only moments before Caldwell's arrival. But it was what Caldwell found on the walls that caused him to flee back into the stormy night, despite the dangerous conditions. The walls were entirely covered with hundreds of sketches, drawings, and diagrams, all executed with extraordinary precision on yellowing paper. Each image depicted human eyes, nothing else, just eyes, rendered with unsettling anatomical detail. Some appeared to be medical illustrations complete with cross-sections and labeled parts. Others were more artistic representations, showing eyes in various states of emotion, wide with fear, narrowed in suspicion, vacant in expression. The drawings were arranged chronologically, Caldwell would later report, with dates spanning back to 1884. Each was executed with remarkable skill, capturing minute details of iris patterns and subtle variations in shape and color. The effect, as Caldwell described it, was of being in a room where hundreds of disembodied gazes were fixed upon you from every direction. What disturbed Caldwell most, according to his statement, was that beneath each drawing was a date, a location, and what appeared to be a name. The most recent drawing was still wet with ink, dated November 10, 1909, just 2 days prior to Caldwell's discovery. He had even gone so far as to stoke the fire in the stove and help himself to a small portion of the stew, which he described as venison, potatoes, and something I couldn't identify, with a bitter aftertaste that lingered on the tongue. What prompted his hasty departure, he claimed, was a sound from what appeared to be a small adjoining room. A soft scratching, like a pencil on paper, followed by what he described as a strange rhythmic sound. Caldwell grabbed his rifle and fled into the storm without investigating further, preferring to risk the elements rather than encounter the cabin's occupant. Caldwell admitted in his statement that he had initially intended to wait out the storm in the cabin despite his unease. When Caldwell finally made his way back to Sharpsville the following morning and reported his discovery to the local constable, an initial investigation was organized. 3 men, including Constable James Harlow, accompanied Caldwell back to the site, but they were unable to locate the cabin. After 2 days of searching, the expedition was abandoned, with some members suggesting that Caldwell had become disoriented in the storm and could not accurately recall the location. The report filed by Constable Harlow noted that Caldwell appeared genuinely disturbed by his experience and was not a man given to flights of fancy or exaggeration. Nevertheless, without physical evidence or corroboration, the matter was considered unworthy of further investigation. The report concluded with the observation that the isolated nature of these hills breeds strange tales, and Mr. Caldwell may have encountered nothing more than an eccentric hermit with unusual artistic proclivities. Caldwell maintained the veracity of his account until his death in 1927, though many in the community dismissed his story as the hallucination of a man suffering from exposure to the elements. The matter might have been entirely forgotten had it not been for what occurred the following spring. In April 1910, a surveying team from the Ohio Railway Company, mapping potential routes for a new line, discovered human remains in a remote area approximately 7 miles from where Caldwell believed he had found the cabin. The 4-man team had been working their way through a particularly dense section of forest when they noticed several crows circling and landing in a small clearing ahead. Upon investigation, they discovered the remains. The deceased was positioned in a manner that immediately struck the survey team as deliberate rather than accidental. The corpse was seated upright against a large oak tree, hands folded neatly in its lap, in what appeared to be a contemplative pose. The body was that of a male of indeterminate age, wearing clothes that appeared to be at least 2 decades out of fashion. A frock coat of a style popular in the 1880s, high-collared shirt, and boots that showed signs of extensive repair and care despite their age. What made the discovery particularly disturbing was the condition of the body. According to the coroner's report filed in Athens County on April 23, 1910, the deceased had no eyes. The report indicated that they appeared to have been removed with precision and care. The coroner, Dr. Thomas Wilson, noted that there were no other signs of struggle, writing that the individual appears to have been carefully positioned after his passing. Dr. Wilson further noted that the body showed no signs of resistance, leading to perplexing questions about the circumstances. The cause of death was indeterminate due to the condition of the remains, though Dr. Wilson noted that the relatively small amount of evidence at the scene suggested the individual had been transported to the location after his passing. The identity of the deceased remained unknown. No missing persons reports matched the description, and no one from the surrounding communities claimed to recognize the clothing or personal effects found with the body. The case was noted in county records as an unresolved death of unknown cause and was effectively closed due to lack of evidence. However, what connected this discovery to Caldwell's account was found in the pocket of the deceased's jacket. A small notebook containing precise, detailed drawings of human eyes rendered in a style identical to those Caldwell had described seeing in the cabin. Each drawing was accompanied by a date, location, and name, just as Caldwell had reported. The notebook contained 47 such drawings, with dates ranging from 1885 to 1909. The last entry in the notebook was dated November 10, 1909, the same date as the most recent drawing Caldwell claimed to have seen in the cabin. This drawing was accompanied by the notation, "Final acquisition complete. The collection now numbers 212. Preparation for transcendence begins tomorrow." This coincidence prompted Sheriff William Doherty to reopen the investigation into Caldwell's claims. A more extensive search was organized in May 1910, utilizing local guides familiar with the terrain. After nearly a week of methodical searching, the expedition discovered the remnants of a structure that matched Caldwell's description, though it had apparently been destroyed by fire sometime during the winter months. The cabin had been located in a small valley approximately 5 miles from the nearest maintained trail, in an area rarely visited even by local hunters due to its difficult terrain. According to the report filed by Sheriff Doherty, the structure had been reduced entirely to ash and charred timber, with only the stone foundation and chimney remaining intact. The fire appeared to have been intense, suggesting deliberate destruction rather than an accidental blaze. The area surrounding the burnt cabin yielded several disturbing discoveries. Buried in shallow graves around the perimeter were various personal effects, watches, rings, spectacles, and other items that would have been carried on one's person. Each item was carefully wrapped in waxed paper with a small label attached bearing a name, date, and location, corresponding to the entries in the notebook found with the deceased. Sheriff Doherty's report noted that these items appeared to be trophies or remembrances, rather than valuables kept for their monetary worth. Many of the items were of minimal financial value, but significant personal importance. Wedding bands with inscriptions, heirloom watches, personalized jewelry. The care with which they had been preserved and labeled suggested a collector's mentality, rather than that of a common thief. Most unsettling was a collection of small glass jars discovered beneath the burnt floorboards of the cabin in what appeared to have been a small cellar or storage space partially protected from the fire. Each jar contained a cloudy liquid and unidentifiable specimens. Each jar bore a small paper label with a name, date, and location. Dr. Wilson, upon examining these specimens, noted that they showed extraordinary care in their preservation, further supporting his theory that the individual had medical training. He also observed that the items appeared to have been collected and maintained with meticulous attention to detail and organization. The investigation that followed pieced together a disturbing narrative through interviews with residents throughout the region and a review of county records dating back to the mid-1880s. According to these findings compiled in Sheriff Doherty's final report, which was sealed until 1958 due to what county officials described as its disturbing nature, a pattern of disappearances had occurred throughout southeastern Ohio and parts of West Virginia for at least 2 decades prior to the discovery. While the disappearances were sporadic and spread across a wide geographical area, they shared several common elements that had gone unnoticed due to the lack of communication between isolated communities and the absence of any centralized record-keeping system for missing persons during that era. The individuals who went missing were often travelers, salesmen, or individuals who lived alone at the outskirts of communities. In each case, the person simply vanished without evidence of struggle or violence. In most instances, the disappearances were not even formally reported, as transience was common in the economically challenged region. People frequently moved in search of work, particularly in the mining and timber industries that dominated the area's economy. What connected these cases, according to Doherty's investigation, was a curious detail mentioned by at least one witness in each community where a disappearance had occurred. Multiple individuals reported encountering a stranger shortly before each disappearance. A man described as unremarkable in every way except for his intense gaze. Several witnesses used the phrase, "he looked right through me," or similar expressions to describe their interaction with this individual. Eliza Johnston, a shopkeeper in the small community of Millfield, provided a typical account. In March of 1906, she recalled serving a customer, a traveling salesman selling patent medicines, who had mentioned encountering a peculiar fellow on the road the previous day. The salesman had described how the man had asked detailed directions to several nearby communities, but what had struck him as odd was how the stranger had stared at him throughout their conversation. "He said it wasn't threatening exactly," Johnston recalled in her statement to Dougherty, "but more like the man was memorizing every detail of his face, particularly his eyes. Said it gave him a chill he couldn't explain." The salesman had stayed in Millfield that night, then departed the following morning toward Gloucester. He was never seen again, and his employer reported that he never arrived at his next scheduled stop. The man was never clearly described. Accounts varied widely regarding his height, build, and other physical characteristics. The only consistent element was the description of his eyes, which witnesses invariably described as unusually light or almost colorless. Several accounts mentioned that he often wore tinted spectacles, even in conditions where such eyewear would typically be unnecessary. The investigation was ultimately inconclusive. No suspect was ever identified, and no further remains were discovered, despite an expanded search of the area. The case was officially classified as unresolved in October 1910 and was largely forgotten by all except those directly involved. The matter might have remained buried in county archives indefinitely had it not been for Dr. Raymond Harlow, a professor of forensic psychology at Ohio University and the grandson of Constable James Harlow, who had participated in the original search following Caldwell's report. In 1962, while researching historical criminal cases in Appalachia for an academic publication, Dr. Harlow discovered his grandfather's personal journal, which contained details of the investigation not included in the official reports. The journal described how, during the search of the burnt cabin site, investigators had discovered a hidden cellar beneath the structure, accessible through a trapdoor that had been concealed beneath the cast-iron stove. This cellar, unlike the smaller storage space where the preserved specimens were found, had apparently been designed as a workspace. Constable Harlow's journal described it as approximately 8 feet square, with walls lined with shelving holding various medical implements, reference books, and jars of chemicals. A wooden table occupied the center of the space, constructed from heavy timber. A drainage channel had been cut into the earthen floor beneath the table, leading to a small pit that, according to the journal, contained residue of concerning materials. The cellar contained a primitive workspace, various instruments, and an extensive collection of medical textbooks, primarily focused on ophthalmology, the study of the human eye. The books dated from the 1860s through the 1890s and contained numerous handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting matched that found in the notebook discovered with the deceased. Most disturbing was Constable Harlow's description of a leather-bound journal found hidden within the earthen wall of the cellar. This journal, which was not mentioned in any official report and apparently was never submitted as evidence, contained what appeared to be the personal writings of the cabin's occupant. The journal entries, as described by Constable Harlow, revealed a disturbed mind obsessed with the human eye as the window to the soul, and the belief that by collecting and studying eyes, one could see the world as others see it, and ultimately achieve perfect vision, the ability to see all things past, present, and future. The earliest entries, dated 1882, appeared relatively lucid, detailing the author's fascination with ophthalmology and his frustration with what he perceived as the limitations of conventional medical understanding. He described experiments with optical instruments and his development of preservation techniques for his studies. The journal's author claimed to have been a medical student at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia in the 1870s, before being dismissed for experiments deemed unethical by his professors. He described how he had retreated to the Appalachian wilderness to continue his research without interference, selecting subjects who would not be missed from among travelers passing through the region. An entry from 1884 marked a disturbing evolution in the author's thinking. Animal specimens have reached their limit of usefulness. The secret of vision cannot be unlocked through these studies. Only human eyes contain the essence I seek, the capacity to perceive not merely light and form, but beauty, emotion, and meaning. My work must advance to the next stage, though I recognize the practical and ethical complications this presents. The subsequent entries detailed the author's methodical preparation for this next stage, the construction of the cabin in a remote location, the acquisition of more sophisticated tools, and the development of improved preservation methods. The journal detailed a disturbing methodology. The author would observe potential subjects from a distance, making detailed sketches of their eyes before determining if they possessed the quality of vision he sought. This selection process was described in pseudoscientific terms, with the author claiming to have developed a system for identifying individuals whose eyes contained exceptional perceptive capacity based on subtle variations in iris pattern and what he termed the light of consciousness. If deemed suitable, the subject would be followed, sometimes for days, until an opportunity presented itself. The journal described various methods employed for this purpose, including offering shelter to travelers caught in inclement weather, presenting himself as a guide to those who appeared lost, and in some cases, simply approaching isolated individuals in remote areas. What followed was described in clinical detached language that revealed the disturbing nature of his actions. The author claimed his procedures were necessary because the essence of vision departs at the moment of passing, and thus his specimens must be collected under specific conditions. The author described how he would preserve his collected items and commune with them, believing that by studying them under various conditions and light sources, he could absorb their visual essence and expand his own perception. The later entries became increasingly incoherent, with the author claiming that he could see through the eyes of others and perceive realms beyond human understanding. An entry from 1902 read, "Subject Aptera 147 has yielded unexpected results. Upon placing the preserved specimen before a mirror during the full moon, I observed not my own reflection, but a scene entirely foreign to my experience, a city of impossible architecture, towers that seemed to defy physical law under a sky of multiple suns. The vision lasted precisely 3 minutes and 17 seconds before fading. I believe this represents a breakthrough in my research, proof that the eyes retain not only their owner's visual capacity, but fragments of every significant image they have perceived during their lifetime." By 1907, the entries suggested that the author had begun experimenting with alternative methods to directly access the visual memory of the specimens. He described these experiences as transcendent but temporary, lamenting that his physical form rejected these methods within hours. The final entries suggested that the author had come to believe that his own eyes were inadequate vessels for his expanded consciousness, and described a procedure whereby he would alter his own perception once his collection was complete. This, he believed, would free him from the limitations of physical sight and allow his consciousness to exist within the collective vision he had accumulated. The last coherent entry, dated November 9, 1909, read, "Tomorrow I shall acquire the final specimen needed to complete the collection. Subject number 212 possesses exactly the quality of vision I have sought these many years, the capacity to perceive what lies beneath the surface of things, to see through deception to truth. Once this acquisition is complete, I shall proceed with the transcendence. What comes after I cannot know with certainty, but I believe I shall see as no human has ever seen before, through all eyes, across all time, beyond the veil that separates the known from the unknown. Dr. Harlow's discovery of this account led him to conduct additional research into the case during the early 1960s. Through careful examination of county records and newspaper archives, he identified at least 27 disappearances between 1885 and 1909 that fit the pattern described in the investigation. In each case, the disappearance occurred within days of reported sightings of an unidentified stranger in the vicinity. Most of these disappearances had never been connected previously, both due to the geographic dispersion of the cases and the lack of any obvious pattern to the victims. They ranged in age from 19 to 73, included both men and women, and came from various social backgrounds, though most were individuals whose absence would not immediately trigger widespread concern or investigation. Dr. Harlow published his findings in the Journal of Historical Criminology in 1964 under the title The Man with No Eyes, Serial Predation in Appalachia, 1885-1910. The article received little attention outside academic circles and was largely dismissed as speculation based on fragmentary evidence and folklore. Several of his colleagues suggested that Dr. Harlow had been unduly influenced by his personal connection to the case through his grandfather's involvement, and that he had perhaps embellished the historical record to create a more compelling narrative. However, Dr. Harlow's research did prompt a brief renewed interest in the case among law enforcement officials. In 1965, a team from the Ohio State Police, assisted by Dr. Harlow, attempted to locate the cabin site using the coordinates recorded in the original investigation. The area had changed significantly in the intervening decades, with logging operations and natural forest growth altering the landscape. After several days of searching, the team discovered what appeared to be the remnants of a stone foundation consistent with the dimensions described in the original reports. Excavation of the site revealed fragmentary evidence consistent with a fire, as well as several artifacts that corresponded to the original investigation's findings: buttons, a pocket watch case, and fragments of glass consistent with the preservation jars described in Sheriff Dougherty's report. Most significant was the discovery of a metal box buried approximately 6 feet from the foundation. The box, apparently a physician's surgical case dating from the late 19th century, had been sealed with wax around its edges, preserving its contents from moisture and decay. It contained several items, including a set of specialized instruments dating from the late 19th century, a magnifying glass of unusual design with interchangeable lenses, and a small leather case containing what analysis would later confirm to be preserved organic tissue. The instruments were of high quality, consistent with professional medical equipment of the era, rather than improvised tools. Several were highly specialized, designed specifically for ophthalmic procedures, supporting the theory that the perpetrator had formal medical training or at least access to professional equipment. Also in the box was a handwritten document dated November 11, 1909, one day after the final entry in the notebook found with the deceased and one day before Caldwell's discovery of the cabin. The document appeared to be a final statement or testament, though it was partially damaged by exposure to moisture despite the wax sealing. The legible portions contained several disturbing passages, including, "My work is complete. The collection has yielded its secrets, and I now understand what must be done. Physical sight is but a limitation, a barrier to true perception. Tomorrow I shall transcend this final boundary and exist within the collective vision I have gathered. Those who find what remains will not understand, for they have not seen as I have seen through the eyes of so many." The document was signed with a name that matched no known record: Dr. Samuel Whitlock, Collector of Visions. The document also contained a passage that appeared to be instructions for a self-performed procedure. The extraction must be performed with absolute precision. I have practiced the sequence of movements until they require no visual guidance. The mirrors are arranged to provide reflection until the first step is complete, after which I must proceed by touch, alone, for the second. The solution is prepared and waiting. Once complete, I shall position myself appropriately and await the transcendence, which I believe will occur precisely at midnight, when the barrier between physical and non-physical sight is thinnest. The investigation concluded that the remains discovered in 1910 were likely those of this Samuel Whitlock, though no record of such a person could be found in medical school registries or public records. A search of Jefferson Medical College records from the 1870s revealed no student by that name, though there was a notation regarding a student who had been dismissed in 1876 for conduct unbecoming a physician and experimental procedures contrary to medical ethics. The student's name had been redacted from the record, a common practice of the era when an individual was considered to have brought shame upon the institution. The presumption, based on the evidence available, was that Whitlock, likely a pseudonym, had indeed carried out his final procedure on himself, removing his own eyes before either succumbing to blood loss or deliberately ending his life. The location where his body was found, seated against a tree several miles from the cabin, suggested that he had walked there under his own power after performing the self-mutilation, an act that Dr. Wilson described as physically possible, but requiring extraordinary determination. The case was officially closed in 1966, classified as a series of historical incidents committed by an unidentified perpetrator who was deceased. Dr. Harlow continued his research until his death in 1968, maintaining that there were likely additional victims who had never been identified or connected to the case. The collection of evidence, including the metal box and its contents, was transferred to the Ohio State Police Archives, where it reportedly remained until 1969, when a fire destroyed a significant portion of the storage facility. According to records, the evidence related to the Man with No Eyes case was among the items lost in that fire, though some have suggested that the destruction may have been deliberate, an attempt to prevent the disturbing artifacts from becoming objects of morbid fascination. What remains are the fragmented documents from the original investigation, Dr. Harlow's research notes, and scattered oral histories from descendants of those involved in the case. These materials paint a disturbing picture of a predator who operated in isolation for decades, driven by a delusional belief system that transformed him into something that residents of the region would describe in hushed tones for generations afterward. In the decades that followed, the story of the Man with No Eyes became part of Appalachian folklore, often distorted and embellished with supernatural elements absent from the documented case. Tales of a phantom watcher who could see through the eyes of animals or who appeared to lost travelers in the forest became common throughout southeastern Ohio. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely the nature of the incidents themselves, but the methodical, patient manner in which they were carried out over such an extended period. The perpetrator operated within a geographical area spanning multiple counties and even state lines, selecting victims carefully to avoid detection and maintaining detailed records of his activities without apparent fear of discovery. The isolation of the communities within the region, the limited communications and law enforcement resources of the era, and the transient nature of many of the victims created perfect conditions for such predation to continue undetected. It raises the unsettling question of how many similar cases throughout history may have gone undocumented due to similar circumstances. In 1967, during the final phase of his research, Dr. Harlow conducted interviews with elderly residents of the region who had lived in the area during the period when the disappearances occurred. One account provided by Martha Collins, then 87 years old and a lifelong resident of Athens County, offered a particularly disturbing perspective. Collins recalled that as a young woman of 28, she had worked briefly as a housekeeper for a physician in Athens. In late 1908, she remembered the doctor receiving a visitor, a man she described as ordinary in every way except for his eyes, which were so pale they seemed almost white. The visitor had introduced himself as a medical researcher interested in unusual ocular conditions and had engaged the doctor in a lengthy conversation regarding ophthalmological procedures and conditions. What had remained in Colin's memory was how the visitor had stared at her as she served tea, not in a manner she described as threatening or improper, but with such intensity that I felt he was memorizing every detail of my face. She recalled feeling so unsettled that she had quit her position shortly afterward, despite the financial hardship this caused her family. There was something wrong about his gaze, Collins told Dr. Harlow. Not just the unusual color, but how he looked at you, like he wasn't seeing you as a person at all, but as something to be studied, categorized. When he looked at me, I felt exposed, as if he could see things about me that I didn't know myself. Collins's description of the visitor matched those given by witnesses near locations where disappearances had occurred, suggesting that the perpetrator occasionally ventured into larger communities, perhaps to acquire medical supplies or information. The physician who had employed Collins, Dr. Arthur Grant, had died in 1918 during the influenza pandemic, so Dr. Harlow was unable to corroborate her account through his records or recollections. Another significant account came from James Hargrove, a postal carrier who in 1909 had been traveling his route near the Ohio River. Hargrove recalled encountering a stranger on the road, a man carrying a leather doctor's bag who had asked for directions to the nearest town. What had struck Hargrove as unusual was that the man had been wearing tinted spectacles despite the overcast day, and had refused his offer of a ride, despite being apparently far from any settlement. Hargrove remembered feeling uneasy about the encounter and mentioned it to several people along his route that day. 3 days after this encounter, according to Hargrove, a peddler who regularly traveled through the area failed to make his usual appearance. The peddler, a Polish immigrant named Stanislaw Kowalski, had established a regular route through the small communities along the Ohio River, selling household goods and simple medicines. His absence was noted, but not immediately considered alarming, as weather or other circumstances often delayed such travelers. However, when Kowalski had not appeared after 2 weeks, some residents became concerned. His employer in Pittsburgh was contacted, and it was discovered that Kowalski had not reported back or collected his next inventory of goods as scheduled. A search was organized but yielded no results. Kowalski was never seen again, and his disappearance was attributed to him simply changing his route or moving to a different region, a common occurrence in the economically unstable area. In retrospect, this disappearance aligned with the pattern identified in Dr. Harlow's research, suggesting that the perpetrator continued his activities until very near the end of his documented existence. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was revealed in the final pages of Dr. Harlow's research notes, which were discovered among his effects after his death. Harlow had managed to locate and interview a distant relative of Everett Caldwell, the hunter who had discovered the cabin in 1909. According to this relative, Joseph Caldwell, his great-uncle Everett had confided something on his deathbed that he had never included in his official statement. When he had first entered the cabin and observed the drawings on the walls, he had heard movement from a small adjoining room whose door was slightly ajar. Peering through the crack, he had glimpsed a figure seated at a small desk, bent over what appeared to be a drawing in progress. What had caused Caldwell to flee immediately was not just this realization that the cabin was occupied, but what he observed when the figure briefly turned toward the door. The man's eye sockets were empty, covered with bandages stained dark, yet the man was meticulously drawing an eye on the paper before him, rendering it in perfect detail despite his apparent loss of vision. Joseph Caldwell told Dr. Harlow that his great-uncle had kept this detail to himself because he feared being thought insane or intoxicated, as what he had witnessed seemed impossible. Only as he faced his own mortality did Everett Caldwell feel compelled to share the full truth of what he had seen that November day in 1909. This detail, if accurate, suggests that the perpetrator's delusion had progressed to its final stage and that he had indeed altered his own perception, yet somehow continued his work for at least a brief period afterward. A medical impossibility that defies rational explanation. One possible interpretation, proposed by Dr. Harlow in his notes, was that Whitlock may have begun his procedure gradually, allowing him to complete his final drawing before completing the process. However, the precision of the artwork described by Caldwell, combined with the apparently fresh bandages covering both eye sockets, contradicts this theory. An alternative explanation might be that Caldwell, shaken by his discovery of the disturbing artwork and the strange atmosphere of the cabin, misperceived or misremembered what he had seen, perhaps glimpsing the figure in profile or shadow and filling in details later as his mind processed the traumatic experience. The case of the man with no eyes remains one of the most disturbing documented instances of serial predation in American history, not merely for the nature of the crimes themselves, but for the methodical patience and isolation in which they were carried out. It stands as a reminder of how vulnerable remote communities were in an era before modern communications and law enforcement techniques, and how a determined individual could operate undetected for decades in such conditions. The forests of Appalachian, Ohio, have changed significantly since those days. Logging, mining, and development have altered landscapes that once concealed isolated hollows and hidden cabins. Yet there remain vast stretches of wilderness where one might still wander for days without encountering another human being. Local guides and forestry workers occasionally report finding the remnants of structures deep in the woods, cabins, hunting blinds, and shelters whose origins and purposes have been lost to time. Most are simply the abandoned projects of long-forgotten settlers or outdoorsmen, but some, perhaps, hold darker secrets. In 1968, shortly before his death, Dr. Harlow made a final note in his research journal that remains particularly unsettling. During an interview with an elderly resident of a nursing home in Marietta, Ohio, he had been told of a local superstition that had persisted in some remote communities. It was considered dangerous to make direct eye contact with strangers passing through the area, as there had once been a man who collected the sight of those who looked upon him too long. This superstition, dating back generations, suggests that awareness of the predator's activities had spread through the region via oral tradition even before the official investigation had connected the disparate disappearances. More disturbing was the residents' insistence that the man had not died in 1909, as the official record indicated, but had transcended physical form and continued to wander the forests of the region, now existing as something neither fully human nor entirely spectral, a being that could see through the eyes of others and would collect new specimens when necessary to refresh his vision. While such accounts clearly represent the transformation of historical events into folklore and superstition, they speak to the profound impact this case had on the collective psyche of the region. Stories that induce such lingering fear typically contain some kernel of truth, too disturbing to face directly. The factual evidence suggests that the perpetrator known as the man with no eyes ended his own life in November 1909, after carrying out a final self-destructive act driven by delusion. Yet something about this case continues to resonate. The idea that someone could observe so intimately, select so carefully, and operate so methodically while remaining essentially invisible to society at large. Perhaps it is this aspect that transforms a historical crime into an enduring cautionary tale. The possibility that one might be observed, evaluated, and selected by predatory eyes without ever realizing it until too late. In a modern world where we are constantly surveilled, tracked, and profiled, perhaps this century-old case speaks to anxieties that are not entirely historical. One curious footnote to the case emerged in 1966 when Dr. Harlow received correspondence from a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania who had been assisting with research into medical school records. The colleague had discovered that while no student named Samuel Whitlock had attended Jefferson Medical College, there had been a Samuel Whitney enrolled from 1872 to 1876, who had indeed been dismissed from the program just months before graduation. The reasons for Whitney's dismissal were vaguely described in the records as conduct unbecoming a physician, but a notation in the margin of his file, apparently added later by a different hand, mentioned unorthodox theories regarding vision and disturbing philosophical notions regarding the nature of perception. Whitney had apparently been a promising student before his dismissal, with particular aptitude in ophthalmology and surgical technique. His academic record showed him to be methodical, precise, and highly intelligent. Several of his professors had noted his intense focus and exceptional memory for anatomical detail. One evaluation described him as possessing unusual powers of observation and analysis, though somewhat lacking in normal social graces. Following his dismissal, Whitney had apparently vanished from Philadelphia society. No further record of him could be found in city directories, tax records, or professional registries. It was as if he had ceased to exist or had recreated himself under a new identity. If Samuel Whitney and Dr. Samuel Whitlock were indeed the same individual, it would explain the medical knowledge and skill evident in the case. It would also establish a clear timeline. Following his dismissal from medical school in 1876, Whitney may have spent several years refining his techniques and establishing his isolated existence before beginning his collection in the mid-1880s. This connection, while compelling, remains speculative. No photograph or detailed physical description of Samuel Whitney exists in the Jefferson Medical College records, making positive identification impossible. The name similarity could be coincidental, or Whitlock might have deliberately chosen a pseudonym similar to his original name, a common practice among those seeking to obscure their past while maintaining some connection to their former identity. As Dr. Harlow noted in his final publication on the subject, the most disturbing aspect of this case is not what was discovered, but what remains unknown. For every victim identified in the record, how many more went undocumented? For every community where a disappearance was noted, how many others experienced similar losses without connecting them to a pattern? The forests of Appalachia keep their secrets well, and some truths may never emerge from the shadows between the trees. Another intriguing aspect of the case emerged during Dr. Harlow's research into Whitlock's possible background. Several of the textbooks recovered from the cabin site bore ownership inscriptions from the library of Dr. Frederick Holloway, an ophthalmologist who had practiced in Cincinnati during the 1870s and early 1880s. Inquiries revealed that Holloway's office and personal library had been burglarized in 1883, with numerous books, instruments, and medical supplies stolen. The burglary was never solved, and Holloway died of pneumonia in 1884. The stolen items included several rare medical texts on ophthalmology, including an annotated translation of pioneering German research on ocular surgery techniques not widely known in America at that time. These specialized texts would have provided valuable knowledge to someone operating outside the medical establishment, particularly regarding preservation techniques and specialized approaches to the study of vision. The connection to Holloway's stolen library suggests that Whitlock had carefully prepared for his activities, acquiring not just the physical tools but the specialized knowledge necessary for his disturbing project. It speaks to the methodical nature of his approach and his determination to pursue his delusion regardless of the obstacles. In the years since Dr. Harlow's death, no further substantive research has been conducted on the case. The physical evidence was reportedly lost in the 1969 archive fire, and the primary witnesses and investigators have long since passed away. What remains are fragmented records, academic analyses, and the persistent folklore of the region. A brief resurgence of interest occurred in 1975. when author Martin Bellwood published a sensationalized account titled The Collector of Eyes, Terror in Appalachia. The book, marketed as a true crime narrative, took significant liberties with the historical record, introducing fictional characters and dramatic elements absent from the documented case. It was commercially successful, but dismissed by serious researchers as essentially a work of fiction, loosely inspired by historical events. Bellwood's book did, however, prompt several individuals to come forward with family stories that potentially connected to the case. The granddaughter of a man who had disappeared while traveling through southeastern Ohio in 1897 contacted the publisher after recognizing elements of the case that aligned with her family's history. Her grandfather, a watch salesman named Thomas Darrow, had vanished during a sales trip through the region. His sample case had later been found abandoned by the roadside near the town of MacArthur, but no trace of Darrow himself was ever discovered. What made her account particularly relevant was a letter her grandmother had received approximately 2 weeks before Darrow's disappearance. In it, Darrow mentioned encountering a peculiar gentleman who had expressed interest in his watches but seemed more fascinated by studying my face than the timepieces I showed him. Darrow had described feeling unsettled by the man's attention, but had dismissed it as merely the eccentricity of an isolated rural individual. This account, while impossible to verify conclusively, fits the pattern established in Dr. Harlow's research. If accurate, it would add another name to the list of probable victims and further confirm the perpetrator's methodology of observing and selecting targets before approaching them directly. For those who venture into the forests of southeastern Ohio, particularly in the areas around Athens County where much of this story unfolded, local residents still occasionally warn visitors not to venture too deep into the woods alone. While bears, coyotes, and treacherous terrain present the only genuine dangers in the modern era, some older residents still lower their voices when speaking of certain remote hollows where, they insist, people have been known to disappear without explanation. A peculiar postscript to the case emerged in 1982 when a hiker in Wayne National Forest discovered the ruins of what appeared to be a small cabin approximately 12 miles from the site identified in the original investigation. Among the collapsed timbers, he found a metal strongbox containing several personal items, including a pocket watch, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, and a small journal. The journal contained only a single entry, dated April 17, 1903, which read, "I have been watched for 3 days now. I see him at the edge of the clearing each evening as darkness falls. His gaze is unmistakable. I have decided to leave at first light, though I fear it may already be too late." The hiker reported his find to the Athens County Historical Society rather than law enforcement, considering it an interesting historical curiosity rather than evidence of a crime. The items were briefly displayed as part of an exhibition on pioneer life in southeastern Ohio before being placed in storage, their potential connection to the Man with No Eyes case unrecognized until years later when a volunteer cataloging the Society's collection happened to be familiar with Dr. Harlow's research. By then, the provenance of the items had been poorly documented, making it impossible to determine the exact location where they had been found or to conduct a more thorough examination of the site. The journal and personal effects remain in the Historical Society's archives, a tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive footnote to the case. And in some of the more isolated communities, one might still encounter the superstition that it's best not to look too long into the eyes of strangers passing through, a precaution that, while rooted in historical trauma transformed into folklore, perhaps contains a universal wisdom about the vulnerability inherent in being truly seen by another. Some local families still practice the tradition of covering mirrors at night, particularly during the full moon, a custom that predates the Whitlock case but took on new significance in its aftermath. The stated reason varies from household to household: to prevent spirits from using the mirror as a gateway, to avoid seeing something unwanted, reflected behind you, or simply because that's how it's always been done. But the underlying anxiety remains consistent, the fear of being observed without one's knowledge. During his research, Dr. Harlow documented numerous such superstitions that appeared to have evolved from distorted awareness of the Whitlock case. In some communities, it was considered dangerous to sleep with the windows uncovered, lest someone, or something, look in during the night. In others, there were protective rituals to be performed when encountering strangers on isolated roads. Or in the end, what made the man with no eyes so effective in his predation was not supernatural ability or extraordinary strength, but rather his understanding of how to remain unnoticed while noticing everything about his victims, his capacity to see without being truly seen in return. And perhaps there is no more perfect metaphor for the dangers that lurk in isolated places than this figure from the shadows of Appalachian history, watching, selecting, collecting the most intimate windows to the souls of others while revealing nothing of himself until it was far too late. A final unsettling note appears in Dr. Harlow's research journals, dated just weeks before his death. He describes receiving an unmarked envelope containing a single sheet of paper. On it was drawn a human eye, rendered with remarkable anatomical precision and artistic skill. No message accompanied the drawing. No postmark indicated its origin. Dr. Harlow reportedly dismissed this as a prank by a student or colleague familiar with his research, perhaps an attempt to unsettle him or mock his academic interest in the case. Yet he found himself sufficiently disturbed by the incident that he mentioned it to several colleagues and reportedly increased security at his home, installing additional locks and motion-sensitive exterior lighting. The drawing was never found among his effects after his death, which was attributed to natural causes, a heart attack suffered while working late in his university office. His research notes on the man with no eyes case were donated to the Ohio Historical Society by his widow, where they remain available to researchers, a meticulously documented investigation into events that most modern criminologists consider more folklore than fact. Yet the questions raised by the case persist, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. How could a single individual with no apparent support system or resources operate undetected for so many years? How many victims actually fell prey to his delusion? Did he truly believe he could transcend physical limitations through his grotesque collection? Or was this merely the rationalization of a disturbed mind seeking justification for his actions? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what if some fragment of his delusion contained a kernel of truth? What if the human eye, that most complex and mysterious of organs, that window to the soul, as philosophers and poets have called it for centuries, does indeed retain some essence of its owner's perception, some echo of all it has witnessed? It is, of course, a scientific impossibility. The eye is merely a biological camera, transmitting images to the brain where perception actually occurs. The notion that removing and preserving eyes could somehow capture or transfer another's vision is the product of a severely disordered mind, a delusion that led to horrific actions. Yet the power of this story, its persistence in regional folklore, and its capacity to disturb even at a century's remove, speaks to something primal in human fear, the terror of being seen, truly seen, by someone or something that intends harm. It touches on the fundamental vulnerability of being observed, evaluated, and found suitable for predation, a fear that long predates modern concerns about surveillance and privacy. As you walk through forests today surrounded by the rustle of leaves and the calls of birds, it's worth remembering that these same trees once witnessed events that have been almost forgotten. Almost, but not quite. For as long as the story is told, something of those events remains alive in our collective memory, a cautionary whisper carried on the wind that moves between the trees. And if you should find yourself in the forests of southeastern Ohio as darkness approaches and feel suddenly, inexplicably watched, well, perhaps it's best not to look too deeply into the shadows. Some gazes, once met, cannot be easily forgotten. And some observers, once aware of your presence, may take a special interest in the particular way you see the world through those windows to your soul.